Hi there, this is Leif Gregerson. I have written a book called Green Mountain Road and Selected Stories. It's got a short novella in it, which is sort of all military tales. The subtext of the title is Stories of Men Finding Their Way in the Face of War and Revenge. And I studied a lot of themes about war and revenge and different things like that in the book. What I wanted to do today was to read the last story in the collection. It's one I'm pretty proud of. I actually sat down, and what I wanted to do with it was what I wanted to do with the story was to turn it into a novel, but just decided, maybe it'd be better off just as a short story. It's one of my more popular ones. My roommate just loves it, I guess. He reads it over, so he says. Reads it over and over, so he says. But I thought I'd read it to you now. And that way maybe you can be interested in getting the whole book from Amazon.com or, sending me an email. I can be reached at Viking3082000 @yahoo.com. And send me an email, leave me a comment below, whatever. And so here goes. Night Flight Over Fortress Europe by Leif Gregerson. It was a chilly summer night at the Southern England Air Base in July of 1942. Frank Hereford sat in his private quarters reading over the specifications and other information with regards to the new Spitfire Mark 9 he was going to fly at any given moment. He was waiting to be given orders, and though he had a good idea of what they were going to be, secrecy had to be kept until the very last moment. Flying was a game Frank knew well. He had been at it for 15 of his 35 years. Wealthy parents and a lust to navigate the skies allowed him to pursue his goal of being a top-notch pilot when most people in England were lining up for soup or other handouts. It was not a fair system, but now that most of those soup eaters were able to keep 2 feet on the ground and live in relative safety compared to him, flying missions all over Europe, his life at the mercy of his own skill versus that of the enemy, he felt as though justice had been served. Commander Hereford was actually quite pleased at the specifications of the new Spit. It looked like it could fly faster and turn quicker than the new Me-109, and even the Germans' newer plane, the Focke-Wulf 190. He was a bit ticked off that there would be no chance for him to test fly the plane. He was simply given manuals and expected to react to flying it as if he had been flying it all along. This was something that could get dangerous, especially if aerial combat was a possibility. As he was admiring the new plane specifications and mentally going through what it would be like to pull a fast turn on a German plane, drop some flaps, and move in for the kill in the Spit, a knock came at the door. He had known it would be coming, but he would much rather have been sleeping the night away and waking up next to his wife than having to fly another mission out of here. His stomach tightened and he felt the taste of bile in his throat, despite the fact that with his experience, he was possibly the most deadly ace in England. "Commander Hereford, sir," came the voice with a knock. Frank opened the door to see Thompson, one of the brighter young LACs he had taken up in 2-seaters and had more than once thought of recommending for flight training. They said he was too young and hadn't completed his secondary school, so Britain would have to pass on another candidate for the one big thing they lacked most: pilots. "Yes, Thompson, what is it?" he said in a bit of an annoyed tone. He knew he was going to summon, but this was his own way of sounding off that he didn't like being chosen for these tricky assignments that always turned out to be dangerous. It didn't do him any good, but it often kept people edgy when they were around him, especially the lower ranks, which he liked to do. To him, this was one of the God-given privileges that officers had over the lower ranks. "I have orders for you, sir, from the squadron leader," Thompson replied, being careful not to let on that the camp commander made him nervous. Very well, give them to me and don't stand there like I'm going to tip you." "Sorry, sir, my instructions are to give you the orders and watch you destroy them." I suppose burning them would be good enough?" "That would be what was intended in the orders, sir." "Well, I don't smoke, man. What am I supposed to do, eat them?" Thompson handed Commander Hereford his own lighter and took a step back from the door without closing it. The orders read as follows: "Commander Hereford, eyes only. You're to take the new Spitfire Mark 9, Fly to the area marked on the map. Seek out the structure drawn below. Take as many pictures as you can of it, then return to base in a circuitous route. You are not to engage the enemy unless you are forced to. Commander Hereford took a look at the map and then set flame to both documents. He made sure they burned completely and put them into an empty wastebasket. Then he dismissed Thompson and made his way to the pilot's locker room to get into his flight gear. Hereford knew what they were after. Many planes and lives had been lost going after the very same thing. The Germans had been making rockets, and if they were allowed to complete their plans, the entire balance of power could easily be changed between the Allies and Axis. Once he got his gear in order, he made his way to the intelligence building and had a long chat with his friend Archie about German anti-aircraft emplacements and the various airfields that could be alerted to his presence. He had become one of the top pilots in the RAF by his incredible memory and devotion to every detail of each mission, not to mention his skill in marksmanship in the air. This had also made of him part of an even smaller class of men, one of the top live pilots in the RAF. Soon after his all-too-brief briefing, he had climbed into the cockpit of the new Spitfire and was quickly told to expect, once he got the plane in the air and how the camera worked. With a crisp salute and smile, Frank was taxiing down the runway on an adventure he really wished he could have let someone else experience. It did just lift off the main wheels and take up to the air, retracting the wheels for greater speed and lift, and freeing himself from all the bounds of the earth. This was the part of flying Frank loved the most before he had spent all his effort and skill on the completion of a mission, before his plane was shot up and nearly out of gas, or the wheels were leaking hydraulic fluid, forcing him to land belly up. He decided he was going to fly southwest until he hit Cornwall, and then lower his altitude greatly and try to sneak past any German patrols by roughly following the outline of France over the water. A more direct route would take him over Normandy, where a plethora of German airborne and land-based defenses would almost surely pepper him with everything they had. Those were the facts, though most of the missions he and his squadron mates were sent on were out over that area, and any pictures or intelligence received was like gold. Both the Germans and the Allies wanted to find out as much as they could about Normandy and surrounding coastal area, because soon there would have to be an invasion. Little did they know that the invasion would be useless if the rocket-building areas and launchers weren't kept in check or, with any luck, destroyed. Out over the water, a million stars shone above him, and the moon was just over the horizon. It looked so huge, and it sent out a lot of soft yellow light. It was risky to send out a mission at this time of the month when the moon was full, but the planners back home had hoped the extra light could possibly illuminate a target that he would be photographing. He could take pictures in the dark, but as far as finding something worth taking pictures of, that was another problem. This was an incredibly important, super secret mission, but it was also incredibly dangerous and most likely useless. He had flown these rocket finding missions before, and he had yet to see anything but the enemy aircraft he was forced to destroy. Frank had likely shot down more than 30 enemy planes, but he wasn't decorated for them or even recognized for doing so because it was so important to keep his missions quiet. After a little more than an hour of flying over the water, Commander Hereford turned his lithe and powerful Spit into land and headed into some industrial and farm country to the south of Bordeaux. He mentally calculated, with the help of the instrument cluster in the Spit, how long it would take him to check out the area in question. Then he took his altitude down to treetop level in hopes that he could invade more threats in that way, including the unknown capabilities of the German radar. Certainly lower level flights would avoid the radar, but if this was a rocket site, it would most likely give itself away by being doubly fortified with anti-aircraft guns and patrols of German fighters. As he drew in closer, it seemed to him that this was just another falsely acquired piece of intelligence, sending him off on a mission that could likely end his life. Frank neared the target, and as he pulled back on the stick and gained altitude, he thought of his young wife, who had hopefully long since gone to bed, and what would happen if he didn't come home from one of these missions. He loved her dearly, and they had hoped to have a child or two one day. It made him sick to think of raising a child when such brutality and destruction existed. Years back, when the war started, it seemed he was 1,000 years younger. He was so eager to sign up, so full of piss and wind about how he and his squadron would fly over glory to Germany. The Battle of Britain claimed the lives of 60% of his original squadron, and most of the ones that survived that were lost in bomber escort missions over Germany. Even after all that, Frank had decided that he would personally give everything he could of himself to end the war or die trying. So he requested a transfer to intelligence, and here he was. So many people had cheered on the aviators when the Battle of Britain ended. Fact was, when the sirens used to go off, it was very common to see men vomiting from the incredible strain it took for them to fly 2-3 sorties a day, facing down wave after wave of enemies, knowing that each time they failed to nail a bomber or fighter, someone would die either in another aircraft or from having a bomb drop on them. He remembered landing after pitched battles, he and the other men counting the returning planes, hoping all of them made it, knowing that most of the free world was watching too. Still, somehow, as Frank was executing a climbing turn, keeping his eyes peeled at every little abnormality or such as he checked out the area, still, flying was an enjoyable thing to do. The good feeling lasted for about 27 seconds. He was taking the last of the pictures he was going to take, and he came around to spot 2 Me-109s turning to engage him. As a trick to see if he had spotted them, the commander flipped his Spitfire over in a belly-up position and dropped down to about 100 feet from the 1,500 he was taking photos from. It was harder to spot the plane upside down. Though few pilots had the skill to do so, it was a trick that often worked. This time it didn't. One of the 109s was able to spot him and he left the second German plane to cover him while he dove after Frank's Spit. Frank flipped back over and put the throttles to full and dropped down even lower. While he was gaining speed, the first Messerschmitt being in a dive, there was a brief moment when the enemy had him in sights, and the enemy took full advantage, pouring a staccato stream of 20mm cannons rounds from its 2 nose cannons into Hurlford's plane. Frank responded by pulling up, reducing throttle, and putting the Spitfire into a sharp left-hand turn with 60% flaps. The Messerschmitt responded by diving down and trying to copy and outdo the Spitfire, but the Me-109s weren't nearly as good at turns as the Mark 9s. They went through a number of circles, and at the end of the third, Frank had the German plane dead to rights. He unleashed the power of his own guns, the 4 303s, on either wing, and must have hit a fuel line because this plane exploded in the air, and the pilot had no chance to get out to use his chute. For a moment, Frank thought he was in the clear, but then he realized there had been 2 of the Messerschmitts. He closed his eyes for a moment, and before he opened them, he once again heard the staccato rhythm of twin 20mm cannons going off, ripping out most of his rudder, something he would need to return to England. Most pilots of this time would have opened up their canopy and jumped, but instead Frank pulled back his stick and went straight up, where the enemy plane could hear him, but hopefully not see him. He then completed the maneuver by going into a loop, and he ended up right behind and above the German and let loose on him until the German's right wing broke off, which just happened in seconds. In the reality of aerial combat, though, mere seconds can be your life expectancy if you don't learn fast to hit hard and run. This time, the pilot got out and his parachute opened. There was another thing about the gallantry of the skies which was being done less and less as this frightening war continued. If at all possible, a fighter pilot will take out the plane instead of the pilot. The kill was good. It actually had left Commander Hereford with an immense feeling of satisfaction. Unfortunately, the fight had also left him without a portion of his tail rudder. He could still steer, the damaged control surface wasn't completely gone, and the plane actually didn't turn with just the rudder. He was going to have problems getting his damaged Spit back to England, because he would only be able to make awkward turns, and it was a rough wind. If there was a rough wind when he went to land, just using his ailerons, which were on the main wings, was going to make things difficult. But Hereford had been through difficult landings before. There had been one landing where he had just 2 ounces of fuel left in his tanks, and he was being pursued by a Focke-Wulf